The episode begins with Zuko's ship drifting at sea, and he is meditating when Iroh enters with news about the Avatar. When Iroh admits he has no idea where the Avatar is, Zuko gets angry and makes the candles flare up. Iroh explained that there have been many sightings of Aang, but he is hard to find. Zuko grabs the map and asks how he is supposed to catch someone who's so good at hiding. Meanwhile, Aang, Katara, and Sokka are flying on Appa over the South Sea, with Sokka pointing out that Aang is bad at navigation. Katara is busy sewing Sokka's pants while Aang tries to impress her with an airbending trick using marbles, but she ignores him. Sokka makes a rude comment about girls, and annoyed, Katara throws his unfinished pants at him. Aang lands Appa on a small Earth Kingdom island, and Sokka complains that they've made too many detours and need to head to the North Pole. Aang sees a big fish jump out of the water and strips down to his underwear to ride it, trying to impress Katara. While riding an elephant koi, Aang is attacked by a giant eel-like creature called the Unagi, and scared, he runs back to land and gets dressed. Suddenly, a group of warriors ambushes them, ties them up, and reveals themselves. Sokka is shocked to see that they are all women and makes a rude comment. One of the warriors threatens him, but Katara apologizes and says her brother can be an idiot sometimes. The islanders demand to know why Aang, Katara, and Sokka are there, and Aang says they just wanted to ride elephant koi. Oyaji, the island leader, is suspicious and thinks they might be Fire Nation spies. He says Kyoshi Island has stayed out of the war and wants it to stay that way. Aang mentions Avatar Kyoshi, saying he knows her, but Suki says that's impossible because Kyoshi died over 400 years ago. Aang explains he's the new Avatar, but no one believes him, and they talk about throwing him to the Unagi. To prove himself, Aang airbends and amazes the villagers, convincing them he really is the Avatar. News of the Avatar's return quickly spreads and reaches Zuko and Iroh. Surprised, the prince gets ready to head to Kyoshi Island. Meanwhile, Aang and Katara enjoy a feast given by the townspeople, while Sokka sulks after being beaten by girls. The villagers clean and decorate the statue of Avatar Kyoshi in Aang's honor, and later, Aang shows off to the girls of the island, which annoys Katara. Sokka sees the Kyoshi Warriors training and asks for a workout, and Suki challenges him. When Sokka tries to show off, she easily defeats him, tying him up and throwing him to the ground, and embarrassed, Sokka leaves the dojo. Meanwhile, Katara asks Aang to help carry supplies, but he refuses and invites her to fly with him and the village girls on Appa instead. When she says no, Aang accuses her of being jealous, and frustrated, Katara storms off. Meanwhile, Sokka returns to the training area, bows to Suki, and asks to be trained properly. Suki agrees but makes him promise not to care about being taught by a girl, and Sokka apologizes for his earlier rude comments. She also makes him wear the Kyoshi Warrior uniform. At first, he complains about wearing a dress, but Suki explains the uniform stands for honor and bravery. Sokka starts feeling proud, until Aang walks by, laughs, and compliments his nice dress. Suki starts training Sokka in Kyoshi-style fighting, and Sokka thinks he is getting it but accidentally throws his weapon out the door. Suki laughs and explains that it's not about strength, but about using the opponent's force and timing the strike. Sokka manages to knock Suki down. Embarrassed, she first says it was on purpose, then admits he did it and tells him to try again. Meanwhile, Aang tells Katara he plans to find and ride the Unagi, and after arguing, Aang runs off. He waits in the water while the village girls watch from the beach, but they get bored and leave. Katara shows up, and she and Aang apologize and joke about their earlier fight. Suddenly, the Unagi appears and attacks, throwing Aang hard into the water and knocking him unconscious. As the Unagi charges at Aang, Katara quickly swims to save him. She uses her waterbending to push them to shore, where she sees Fire Nation troops arriving. After they pass, she bends water out of Aang's throat, waking him up, and Aang warns her not to try riding the Unagi. Meanwhile, Oyaji rushes to Sokka, Suki, and the Kyoshi Warriors for help. They run into battle and skillfully fight off the firebenders, even though they are outnumbered. Zuko and his troops burn the town while searching for Aang. The Kyoshi Warriors manage to knock Zuko and his men off their rhinos. Suki and her team surround Zuko, but he uses firebending to break free. He spots Aang and sarcastically compliments him before they fight briefly, causing more destruction to the town. Upset by the damage, Aang flees to find Katara, and Katara tells him the firebenders will keep chasing them, so Aang agrees they have to leave. Suki tells Sokka to leave, but he refuses until he apologizes for treating her like just a girl instead of a warrior. Suki kisses him on the cheek and says she's both. Suki goes back to fighting, giving Aang, Katara, and Sokka a chance to escape. As they fly away, Zuko and his soldiers chase after them, and Katara tells Aang he did the right thing by leaving. Aang suddenly jumps off Appa into the water, grabs the unagi, and rides it toward the village. The unagi sprays water to put out the fires. Aang then jumps back onto Appa, and they all fly off into the sunset while the unagi swims below. The episode begins with Aang and his friends arriving at Omashu. Sokka and Katara are amazed, saying there's nothing like it at the South Pole. Aang wants to enter quickly, but Katara warns it's dangerous if people know he's the Avatar, and she tells him to wear a disguise. Aang uses Appa's fur for a wig and mustache, speaks in an old man voice, and uses his staff as a cane. Sokka says Aang looks like their grandfather, and Katara says, since he's 112 years old, the disguise fits. As they reach the city walls, Aang says Omashu is one of the friendliest places. But the guards are yelling at a cabbage merchant for bringing in rotten cabbages. They earth-bend his cart into the valley, prompting the merchant to scream. Aang tells Sokka and Katara to keep smiling as they walk up to the guards, but one stops them by holding a boulder over Aang's head and asks for their business. Using his old man voice, Aang says his business is private and threatens to bend the soldier over his knee. The guard tells him to calm down and asks for his name. Aang says he is Bonzu Pippinpaddlopsicopoulos III and calls Sokka and Katara his grandchildren. Katara introduces herself as June Pippinpaddlopsicopoulos, and the guard looks at them for a moment, then tells June to keep her grandfather out of trouble and lets them pass. As Sokka walks by, the guard captain stops him, and the team gets worried, but the captain only scolds Sokka for not carrying his grandfather's bag. As they reach the wall, it is bent open, and Sokka and Katara are amazed by the size of the city. As they walk through and the gates close behind them, Momo pops his ears out from Aang's wig, surprising the guard captain. Aang shows Sokka and Katara the Omashu delivery system, tubes and chutes that move packages through the city with earthbending. He says that 100 years ago, he and his strange friend Bumi used to slide down them for fun. Aang promises Katara they'll head to the North Pole after one ride. They go to the highest point and slide down, nearly getting hit by a package of spears chasing them. Aang steers them off the chute, and their bin scrapes over rooftops. They can't stop and crash into the cabbage merchant's cart, and he screams again over his ruined cabbages. Guards surround them and arrest them for vandalism, traveling under false pretenses, and malicious destruction of cabbages. The king, who is an old man, stares at Aang for a moment, and instead of punishing them, orders a feast, surprising the guards and Team Avatar. At the feast, the king asks where Aang is from. Aang lies and says Kangaroo Island, and the king jokes that it sounds really hoppin', and Sokka laughs. Pretending to leave the table, the king suddenly throws a chicken drumstick at Aang. Aang catches it with airbending, revealing he is the Avatar. Aang and the others try to escape, but the guards stop them. The king declares Aang must face 3 deadly challenges the next day to win freedom for himself and his friends, then locks them in a newly refurbished chamber. The next day, Aang wakes up and sees that Sokka and Katara are missing. The king appears and says they are being held hostage and will be freed after Aang completes the challenges. Aang angrily demands their return, but the king brings them out and places rings of genomite, creeping crystal, on their fingers. The crystals slowly grow to cover the body, and only the king can stop it. To save his friends, Aang agrees to take on the king's challenges. For the first challenge, Aang must retrieve a lunchbox key hanging from a chain behind a strong waterfall. But the water's force is too great to swim through or climb the ladder beneath it. Even airbending doesn't work. Meanwhile, the crystal creeps up Katara and Sokka's arms. Aang breaks the tip off a stalagmite and, using airbending, launches it like a dart through the water. It breaks the chain, and the key flies to the king, who watches from a balcony. For the second challenge, Aang must find the king's lost pet, Flopsy. Outside, he spots a rabbit and chases it, thinking it's Flopsy. But a giant goat gorilla appears and chases Aang. The rabbit runs off, and the monster gets closer. Aang suddenly stops and realizes the creature is the real Flopsy. Flopsy gently picks Aang up, licks him, then runs to the king, who rubs its belly. Katara and Sokka are now covered in crystal from head to ankle, and Aang demands the final challenge begin. For the final challenge, Aang must fight an opponent of his choice in a large arena. He is shown two fierce warriors, a sharp-toothed assassin with a war scythe, and a huge masked gladiator with an axe. Aang asks if he can fight anyone he points to, and the king says yes, warning him to choose carefully, and Aang points to the king himself. The king declares Aang chose wrong and removes his robes, revealing a muscular body. Aang realizes his mistake as the king says he's the most powerful earthbender Aang will ever face. Aang tries to switch to the axe guy, but the king refuses, saying there are no take-backsies in his kingdom. The king hurls boulders at Aang, who dodges them, and the king mocks Aang for using typical airbender moves and taunts him for not fighting back. Eventually, Aang starts to counter, and with great effort, the king rips a huge chunk of earth from the ground and lifts it over his head. Terrified, Aang runs in circles and creates a tornado, and the king throws the giant rock, but the tornado sends it back. The king splits it in two, but Aang appears through the dust and pins him with his staff. The king admits defeat but says Aang must first guess his name before freeing his friends. Thinking back on the challenges, Aang realizes they all pushed him to think differently. He figures it out and calls the king his old friend Bumi. Bumi laughs and calls Aang a mad genius, and they hug, and Bumi says Aang hasn't changed at all. Bumi then shatters the crystal trapping Sokka and Katara and eats a piece, revealing that Genomite is actually rock candy. Sokka and Katara are shocked to learn the king is Aang's old friend and ask Bumi why he made Aang go through all the challenges instead of just revealing himself. Bumi says he enjoys messing with people, but more importantly, Aang as the Avatar must restore balance by defeating Fire Lord Ozai. Since the world has changed so much in the 100 years Aang was gone, Bumi says he still has a lot to learn, and hopes that when he does, he'll think like a mad genius. Aang thanks Bumi for everything and challenges him to one last ride. They slide down the Omashu delivery system like they did 100 years ago, crashing into the cabbage merchant's cart, just like Team Avatar did earlier.